Please welcome Todd Bishop.
Wow, this is an amazing space, and I had no idea that this group was going to be this big, and I had no idea I was going to be up here kind of doing the Carly Fiorina thing on the central stage, but I will do it. I've watched enough CES keynotes that I can pull this off, I know. John sends his regrets. John's mom passed away earlier this week. There's a story on Geekwire yesterday, so you can read a little bit more about the influence that John's mom, Sally, had on Geekwire directly. So I'd encourage you to read the story about her. It is my pleasure to be here. I like to start some of my talks with this house, and I'll explain to you why this house is relevant. Does anybody know what this house is? Anybody? So if I told you this house was in Bellevue, would you have any other sense for where it was? Okay, you just gave away the punchline. All right, that's always the risk with this one. So this is a house in Bellevue. It's at the end of a long winding road, and if you wouldn't know the difference between this house and others in the neighborhood until you looked at the mailbox. And the one on the left, which I still believe is still there today, is about 5 times bigger than your average mailbox. And the reason is that the guy who rented this house about 20 years ago needed all that extra room for the book catalogs that he was receiving, for the index that he was building, for the website that he was developing. So yes, that's correct. This is the birthplace of Amazon.com. And really, this to me, I love to bring this up because we talk a lot about startups and differentiate them sometimes from the big tech companies, but really when you're talking about startups, in a lot of ways, you're talking about potentially the next Amazons. And a lot of what we do at Geekwire is we cover the whole breadth of these things, and we're looking in the startup community for not only companies that are making an impact on their current level, but the ones that have the potential to become the next Amazon. And obviously this has really defined the Seattle technology community for the past decade, the growth of this company. And it's just been one of the stories that we've been lucky enough to be able to cover here. So today I want to talk to you about the Seattle tech community through the lens of Geekwire, and tell you a little bit about the story of how we started the site, why we started it, but really focus on the topic of community and the role that it's played in helping us build a central hub and events and news business in the middle of all this. So just the quick background, John and I were longtime reporters at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. We met in the newsroom and really recognized, as many of you I'm sure have in your jobs, that the people above you knew less about what needed to be done than you knew, or at least we certainly thought that at the time. And the PI, for those of you who don't remember, was owned, and PI.com is still owned by the Hearst Corporation in New York. And so we decided, this was us pre-startup, me with hair, and this was the moment when, back in 2008, we realized it was time to do something different. And Geekwire was founded on the principle that Seattle and the Pacific Northwest deserve a technology news site and online community of their own. And that really is our guiding principle. A lot of people will initially believe, oh, you're a local news site. Get it, totally get it. And that is not the lens that we view the world through. We say that there is so much happening here that it's relevant everywhere. And I think everybody in this audience knows that to be the case. The way it's shaken out, about 20% of our audience is Washington State. For people who know Geekwire, that often is a surprise, because I think, rightly so, I hope people look at us as their hometown tech news site. But in fact, the vast majority of our readership is outside of Seattle. It's in Silicon Valley, it's in Austin, it's in New York, it's in Europe, and it's in Asia. People around the world want to know what is happening in this community. And we believed then, and we continue to believe now, that those stories need to be told to the world. And that's really what our goal is on the news site, on the news side of Geekwire. Through that process, oh, and just one other thing. So we've taken a different approach than many tech news sites. For example, in Silicon Valley, the whole idea is to raise vast amounts of capital. If you look at Pando Daily, Recode, GigaOM, sites that may or may not be around anymore in different incarnations, they would raise tons of money and then hire huge amounts of staff and try and chase it, realize 5 years later that they couldn't, and then suddenly decide that they needed to sell to save face. That is not what we've done, and that is not where we're headed. We raised a small amount of angel investment from one investor, Jonathan Sposato, very early on, and from that point we have completely bootstrapped our growth. So we have literally 3 primary shareholders in the company, John Cook, myself, and Jonathan Sposato, and it creates all sorts of flexibility when you're able to essentially grow the company organically and make it long-term sustainable. And that really is our goal here, is to create a long-term independent media brand to serve the Seattle technology, creative, innovation, and scientific communities. Now, that word community is very important, and it's critical to what we do. We run about 9 to 12 events a year, and this has been a real lesson and something that we have really learned how to do by trial and error. It's been fascinating for 2 newspaper reporters to figure this stuff out. The events that we do are really driven by largely the startup community, and they range from meetups to a giant ping pong tournament to our Sounders Day event and to the Geekwire Awards. And coming up on October 2nd and 3rd in Seattle this year, my one plug, the Geekwire Summit is coming up. We have the CEOs of eBay, Ring, the Gates Foundation, Boeing, and many others speaking. This was Satya Nadella from Microsoft there last year. This has been a fascinating journey for us, the events, being able to do live journalism in front of an audience. And one thing we've learned about community in particular through this process is what we want as journalists and what we're looking for out of these events is not always what the audience wants. It's been fascinating doing these interviews on stage because I used to do them just on the phone or in person, and it was one-on-one, or in the case of a high-profile executive, one-on-one with 4 PR people tuning in and listening. Our main goal is to get news out of the person, news. And what we realized at the events is the community, yeah, they want news, but they want that on the site. What they want at the events is insight and value. Things they can take away, things they can go back to the office and tell their boss, hey, this is what I learned, this is what matters. And it's been a fascinating experience, the feedback loop that we get from the post-event surveys. That is probably the most consistent thing that we hear, is that it's critical for us to understand the audience. And I think that's my lesson number 1 about building community, is that yes, even though we feel like we're part of the community, we try to be a center of the community, we are not necessarily aligned in our news interests, our day-to-day news interests with what the community always wants. And so we've really tried to learn and understand from that. We, last year, launched our own HQ2 search. It was part spoof, but it was actually real. We put out an RFP. We received bids from 10 cities around the country. Our promise was to bring up to 5 jobs and approximately $5,000 in investment, including a few big nights at restaurants in their hometown, for 1 month. And we went through a rigorous process. It was actually really rigorous because we really cared where we were going to be for a month. And we chose Pittsburgh. And we were in Pittsburgh, our team, for the entire month of February 2018. This was a fascinating experience and a real lesson for us in community for 2 reasons. First off, Pittsburgh is an amazing technology and innovation community. If you look at what they have in terms of Carnegie Mellon and all of the robotics and everything else there, Google, even Amazon is there in a small way already. They're amazing, but they lack so much of what we are so fortunate to have here in Seattle. If you look at just the sheer breadth of companies, it's not just that they're lacking the big Microsofts and the Amazons, they're also lacking really the middle tier of companies, the Zillows, the Redfins, Valve, Nintendo, I could go on and on. I think sometimes it's astonishing the number of companies that are here that people don't even think about being here. They loved us. In fact, I meant to bring it. There was an article in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette on the editorial page. Literally it said, from the newspaper, Geekwire gets us. I've got it framed in the office. It is so amazing. But here's the thing, it wasn't because we were, it wasn't about us doing that. It was about them needing something like us, them needing somebody, whoever, to come in and create a center of gravity using news as the reason to bring people in. People need to come in and understand what's happening in the community with exclusive news, and then to do all sorts of interesting things with that community that is formed around that. And it was just a sheer eye-opener in so many ways, because it made us realize how fortunate we are to have what we have in Seattle. The other way that it was really fascinating was the reaction of people back here when all of a sudden our daily newsletter was filled with, yes, Seattle stories and Pacific Northwest stories too, but Pittsburgh stories. People had no idea what was going on, even though we'd explained it. And it was a real lesson for us in the sensitivities here, the good, constructive sensitivities to what we cover, and the fact that it's valued, the fact that our focus on the Pacific Northwest is valued. This was also really driven home for us at our Geekwire Awards. And this is, I think, one of the main lessons and actually ongoing challenges that we're facing, and I'd love some feedback and guidance on this from all of you. We do cover the breadth of technology companies, and the community is really centered around startups. The broad readership, the reason that 80% of our audience is coming from other markets around the country, the broad readership is really largely interested in the large, big brands. Amazon, Microsoft, even Starbucks, Valve, all those big companies that have global user bases, global interests, those are the ones that draw in that crowd. Now, our events really rely on the startup community. Our audience, on a big scale, really relies on those big companies. At our Geekwire Awards, we had our CEO of the Year category, and the awards started as the Geekwire Startup Awards, and they're still largely startup awards. But this year we had John Ledger, the T-Mobile CEO, who was nominated by our panel of judges and made it into the finalists. Now, I don't know how many of you follow John Ledger on Twitter, but his audience is not small. And he is not a shrinking violet. He is an especially vocal person. So because the vote was essentially a popularity vote, and that's the way we've structured it historically, he trounced everybody. And let me tell you, we heard about it. And a lot of people, rightly so, questioned whether we're truly dedicated to the startup community. And it has been an eye-opening experience this past year to go through that process and really do a lot of self-examination about who we are, what matters, and we're already talking about changing the way we do that category. But more broadly, it's really required, it's caused a gut check for us, almost 8 years into this, about our focus, what matters, and we're already moving things internally, talking about changes we can make to double down on our startup coverage, because even though the audience isn't as large, it really is, it's the seed corn of the community, it's the seed corn of what we do, it's the area that you really have to focus on and cultivate and make sure that it matters and is covered properly. And so I would hope if you're a longtime Geekwire reader, over the next few months you'll start to notice changes that might remind you of the early days of some of our startup coverage. If you're new to Geekwire, I'd encourage you to check it out and know that we have a real commitment to covering the community here. But it's just been a fascinating journey over the past year, and a good lesson in listening to the community, and we're not always as good at that as we should be in the daily rush of news, but it's one of those situations where it's just extremely valuable to have a daily live focus group in the form of your email. We also are extremely focused on diversity at our events, diversity and inclusion, and this is something that I hope you'll see throughout all of our events, particularly in terms of gender diversity. We have a lot of improvements to make in terms of our overall diversity at our events, on our team, just as the rest of the tech community does, and this is also a major focus for us. I am proud of the fact that at our biggest technical conference, the Cloud Tech Summit that we held back in June, we had almost 50-50 gender parity. And so for us, especially at a technical conference in this industry, that was a huge victory. And we're aiming for something very similar and trying to get even better in all forms of diversity at all of our events and try and be real leaders by example on that front. So overall, I want to leave you with the message that we have really been on a journey here. We're up to about 15 people after 8 years. And so what we've done is we've grown modestly over the years, trying to create something sustainable for the Seattle tech community while also expanding beyond our original focus on Microsoft and startups and Amazon to include things like space and science with Alan Boyle, who we were fortunate enough to hire away from NBC News. We've gotten into all sorts of areas like sports and civic innovation. Increasingly, you will see us cover social issues, issues of homelessness, the ways that the tech industry, the innovation economy are impacting all sorts of populations around us, not only in Seattle, but in other cities and regions. And it's just, I hope something that can be a journey that all of you come along with us on. And with that is my overview of where we are in terms of community. I don't know where I am in terms of time, David, but that's my thoughts on community. Thank you. Okay. So Al's question was about our HQ2 project in Pittsburgh, and his question was, number one, it was a two-pronged question. Number one, did it leave a spark in Pittsburgh? In other words, did they say, oh gosh, we got to do this, either through Geekwire or somebody else? And number two, would we do it every year? So let me answer number two first. Before we started our own HQ2 project, which as I said was kind of a spoof and a reality at the same time, and a month in Pittsburgh in February it's very real, let me tell you that. We were determined to make it every year. After we were done, we rethought that. It's a huge commitment. We got it sponsored enough to pay for it, to cover our costs, to cover those meals out at night. But our plan actually currently, and we haven't shared this widely, but it's coming up soon enough that I'm fine sharing it. We do plan to expand to whichever HQ2 city Amazon picks. So we plan to put a reporter there and kind of follow them, because really, if you think about it, there are very few tech organizations that have that insight into them from Seattle. It's different parachuting in here and doing 3 days of interviews with Amazon execs versus living around their employees every day. And also, I think we can bring a perspective to whichever community they go to. And if it's Pittsburgh, we're going to look like geniuses. The people in Pittsburgh, as I said, I framed that editorial because I don't think I think it might be the nicest thing that the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette editorial page has ever written. And they do have a lot of grassroots community organizations, people who do podcasts. They have some tech news sites, but they're pretty small and more hobbies. And the answer to your question is it piqued their interest and made them recognize the value of having somebody cover them every day in and day out, the nitty-gritty, good and the bad. But you really need that big ecosystem to support it in all sorts of different ways. And they don't have that yet from a business perspective. Yeah.
So you mentioned when you talked about Pittsburgh that you were surprises, how effective starting to be, and then how potentially more mature Seattle is, and all of the great people here. Is there anything you saw there that you wish was here?
Yeah. The question was, is there anything we saw in Pittsburgh that we wish was here? Yeah, and for anybody who's been to Pittsburgh, this is going to be stating the obvious. I was just blown away by the sheer connection between Carnegie Mellon and even the University of Pittsburgh and the tech community. And you saw it in the robotics industry, which is just off the charts there. I got to sit down with Red Whitaker, who's essentially one of the fathers of modern autonomous robotics. And he still works in the robotics lab at CMU, but if you go down their robotics row in the Strip District in Pittsburgh, you can basically point from one company to the other that came either from him or one of his colleagues. I mean, the reason that Uber was there before they stopped, for unrelated reasons, as everybody knows, their autonomous driving experiment in Pittsburgh, apart from all the potholes and the horrible turns that basically were the ultimate test for self-driving cars, it was because there is so much robotics talent there. And so, to me, that was the big takeaway. The pipe, and clearly, I don't want to diminish what's happening at the University of Washington, at Washington State University, even at Seattle University and elsewhere with things like CoMotion and Vikram Jandiala and everything that's happening here. But it was some next level stuff in Pittsburgh, and I think there are some lessons we could learn from that here. Yeah. Everybody wants to talk about Pittsburgh. Everybody loves Pittsburgh until you get there. Yeah, in February. You know, it's funny because we did have a bid from Florida, and it was a beautiful video, and they went around, and I realized though, you know, after a day on the beach, one day on the beach, there would be nothing left to cover there. So we sort of took one for the team, as it were, and decided to go to Pittsburgh. So, other questions? Yeah. Great.
So, if you're journalistic research and talking with companies, are you finding that there's more or less of an emphasis put on the design of whatever the thing is that they're designing? I talked to somebody recently who felt that one of the big companies here, which really surprised me, was that they really didn't put much emphasis on the design elements, even though it drives actually everything that they do themselves and experience in the company.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you said you're asking me about the emphasis that companies put on design here in the Seattle community, and you referenced an unnamed company that does not put an emphasis on design and is more interested in selling things. So I'm assuming you're talking about Amazon. Yeah. So it is interesting. And by the way, I should mention, and I feel a little bit awkward sitting up here in front of the Creative Mornings crowd. I will tell you that when we go on our team offsites and we ask our team what the biggest thing we need to improve on, it's UX, UI, basic design, and so I will just tell you that we bookmark that as needs improvement ourselves, and welcome your input. So I would actually categorize this along with Amazon in that way. I have seen really an increased focus here locally, and I don't know how it compares necessarily to Silicon Valley, but the need to communicate professionalism, basically to send a message through user experience in particular, and the notion that design is how it works. And I think through the different products that we see here, we've seen a little bit of a drawback from the notion of the minimum viable product, and we've seen teams and startups wanting to come out and put at least a little bit more emphasis on the polish of the product before they release publicly. And it's been a little bit of a rubber band effect with the MVP approach. Certainly still there's a lot of folks who are just throwing stuff out there and seeing how it sticks to the wall. But I would say that we may not be on the level of some other communities. Not every company is on the level of what we might see with other companies, but I think that's been changing moderately from my small sample size. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm happy to just stand up here and keep riffing about Pittsburgh. Yeah, David.
What do you feel like, what does Geekwire done well in terms of building community together? And what do you feel like it's fallen short of?
Yeah, David asked what we feel like we've done well in terms of building community and what we feel like we've fallen short on. That's a very good question, and I have a hunch that the answer I'm going to come up with in the lift on the way back to the office is going to be much better than the one that I'm going to deliver now, but I'll give it a shot. You know, I alluded to this earlier. You need a reason for people to come back to you every day, every hour, multiple times a day, whether you're building a community organization or a news site, and we really do have an advantage. So I joke sometimes that news coverage is kind of the ultimate content marketing for the rest of the business, right? And that's a very cynical way of looking at it because John and I both come out of journalistic backgrounds and we're very focused on journalism. But to me, I think on the point of success, it just happens naturally that you have a built-in advantage as a news site in terms of drawing in an audience and using that to create a community. I think the thing that we struggled with most is the divide that I mentioned earlier, where we see it at our big events. The way to draw in a big audience to make sure that you're really filling the seats is to get those headliners. You know, every year we make our Elon Musk ask for the Geekwire Summit, you know. That's the level of speaker we're going after. And of course, there's all sorts of speakers in the lineup, but it is a challenge because those speakers at the national level are something of a commodity. They're folks who are talking to a big audience and not necessarily serving the core community that we know is really central to what we do. And I think I alluded to this earlier, but that's where we've most fallen short, is figuring out how to bridge that divide between the startup community and the big tech companies and the big name CEOs that we're trying to attract to events. Yeah, so that's a struggle, and I know that there's other places we've fallen short, and they're just not coming to mind right away. So that's a good question. Larry.
I'm curious what you just mentioned about the difference between the startup people and the big corporations, and also the fact that 20% of your audience is local, 80% is the rest of the world. What kind of business challenges does that present in terms of, like, you know, advertising and the events are pretty much all here, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. So Larry asked, he pointed out that divide and the fact that about 80% of our audience is outside of Washington State and 20% is here, and he asked about the business challenges that creates. So when we started, I'm fine talking about this, about 50% of our revenue, it used to be 50-50, digital and online, or digital and online and events. In terms of revenue, advertising revenue on the online side and sponsorships and tickets on the event side, that ratio has now in some years gotten up to 65-70 from events. And so that is the fundamental challenge there, right? Look at that, it's flipped. Our audience is 80% of people who are probably not going to come to the events, and our revenue is primarily people who are local, who are really keyed into that startup coverage, but who aren't there in the volume that would sustain the business on a big scale. And so that is the fundamental challenge, and it's been difficult because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're trying not to be a local site. We're trying to be the national site from Seattle, which is a slight distinction, but I think an important one. And I don't know how we're going to solve it other than just keep trying to cover everybody as well as we can. And gosh, that is maybe my biggest request is if you could tell us when there are amazing stories out there that we're not getting to, that we don't know about, amazing people that are doing things that should be recognized, companies and technologies that are coming out that are here that we just might not have spotted yet. We need to know those things. Don't assume that we know everything. I mean, I appreciate the fact that everybody likes to read the site and get the news from there, but we need help in finding the next story, and that would be my big request to help us divide that. Hey, hi.
So who would you like to be the media partners, the media partners, have a spot on or like something together? Which one would you like to be a part of?
Do you mean just day-to-day news-wise?
Well, or maybe a weekly spot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the question was, who would we want to partner with media-wise? It's been really interesting. We see this locally. We have a show on Geekwire Radio on the weekends on Saturdays, but we also are on KUOW occasionally. The NPR audience is amazing in terms of their engagement. Geekwire is amazing too for its own reasons, but we get so much word of mouth from just the casual appearances with Bill Radke on KUOW. And so, you know, as we've looked to expand nationally, we have talked with the folks at NPR in Washington, D.C. about some of the projects we're working on. Bloomberg TV is our partner at the Geekwire Summit, and so that is another way that we're doing that. You know, in terms of ideal partners out there, media partnerships are tricky because everybody has their own self-interest. And one thing we've learned from our experiences at the Seattle PI and a stint that we did at American City Business Journals and the Puget Sound Business Journal here is that if you can control your own destiny, whether that's who you're reporting up to or who you're partnering with, it's almost better at times to go it alone. So I will tell you, our default on partnerships is to ask ourselves, do we really need this? Is the value added and worth the commitment that's going to take to try and mesh these two organizations with different potentially competing interests? I realize that is not the classic partnership model, but we don't like to just partner for the sake of partnering. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'd love to hear about somebody that you get envious of, somebody that not something that you get.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. A couple things. So the question was, people were envious of. I'm just going through the list. There's like a list of 50. People were envious of, people who might have thought of things that we wish we had done or that we aspire to do in a way that is on our own, but not necessarily mimicking them. Yeah, adding to it there. I am really in awe of the shift toward email newsletters as a form of news delivery. And I look at what Axios is doing in particular on the national level with politics and with tech, with Ina Fried, and I get so much out of their emails, and it's a big topic of discussion internally as we look at deploying our scarce resources to new initiatives where email fits in on that. And right now we just do essentially mostly automated emails, and the level of engagement that people have with curated narrative emails is just off the charts compared to an automated approach, and we're looking at different ways to do that, which gets back to the startup stuff that I was talking about earlier. Kara Swisher, I think that was Kara back there. Every time we start to put together the lineup for the Geekwire Summit, this has been our biggest challenge because we are trying to make this a destination conference, and that's sort of how we're bridging that divide between the local community and the national interests. Is we want people to come from around the country to Seattle for that event, and for that you need big speakers, people who will attract attendees from across the country, and then they'll stick around and they'll see the Seattle community and hear from speakers. Kara Swisher and Walt Mossberg had such a built-in advantage first at All Things D and then at Recode. I was so disappointed because I look at the lineups that Kara gets with a text, and I'm so envious of that because that's the advantage of being in Silicon Valley, coming out of the Wall Street Journal and being able to just, call up Elon Musk and make sure he's there at the event. For that reason, I was so disappointed when they sold the box. I thought that was almost a tragedy. Here were two people who had so much advantage. They didn't need to have a staff of 60 or 100 people. It was ridiculous, the number of people they had. I'm passionate about this topic, if you can't tell. It was ridiculous. It was a travesty that they weren't able to make a viable, long-term independent business out of that and had to sell to Vox and become part of The Verge. And I realize Walt's retirement, it's total inside media baseball here, apologies, but Walt's retirement had a lot to do with that. You know, but I think it's too bad that they sold. I think they could have built something much cooler on their own. Just with a little bit of restraint and selectiveness in terms of how they spent their money. Gosh, I hope people are tweeting this. Tag @Kara Swisher. I'd love to get into it. I could spend the rest of the day in a Twitter discussion with Kara. So, okay, one more question. Yeah.
Where would you put your first two international offices?
Yeah, that's a great question. If we could, I would put it in China. Put one in China. Just given the amount of hardware innovation, trends. I mean, Taylor Soper, one of our first reporter hire, who is still working with us. He went to China a couple of years ago, and the level of insight we got just from having somebody on the ground in China was remarkable. Of course, it comes with all sorts of regulatory red tape that we wouldn't, the likes of which, it would make Seattle look like, it was easy. But it's that China and probably the UK or Europe to be there, Brussels perhaps for the European Union with everything happening there. That's another question that I might come up with a better answer for later. But those are the two obvious ones, the UK and China. Yeah, and that has been discussed. But first we're going to where Amazon puts HQ2. So thank you, everybody. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you.